So hello again, everybody, and welcome back. Having just had that session, a really interesting session focusing on the lower portion of the 6 gigahertz band, we're now going to move straight on and move the focus onto the upper portion of the band. And again, we have an excellent panel with us to discuss these issues. So without further ado, I'd like to now welcome to the stage our moderator for the session, Graham Louth from Ether. Graham, hi, welcome, and good to have you with us.
Hi, Dan.
Yeah, really interested, really looking forward to this session. I know it's one of the key bands that everyone's talking about at the moment. So yeah, really looking forward to it. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good afternoon. So I'm Graham Louth. I'm a partner with Ether Consulting, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's session on the upper 6 gigahertz band. This band has already been allocated for unlicensed use in some parts of the world, but here in Europe, it's still an open question as to how it might be used in the long-term future. We have obviously a number of competing demands for this spectrum from existing users in the shape of the satellite industry, and also its use for fixed services, terrestrial fixed services in Europe. And we then have two essentially competing new demands for this spectrum in the shape of unlicensed use for Wi-Fi 6E and potentially other services, including 5G new radio unlicensed. But then we also have strong interest in this band for licensed use for IMT. We have representatives of all of those camps on the panel this afternoon, along with representatives from the European policymakers that need to decide what position to take on this band at WRC 23, where it's on part of agenda item 1.2. So to introduce our panel, and I'll introduce all of them straight away and then ask each of them to make a short presentation about their position. So our first panelist this afternoon is Nadia Katsanou. She is the co-chair of the RSPG working group on WRC 23. She is also a senior scientific advisor on spectrum and telecoms at the Greek regulator, the EETT. Our second panelist this afternoon is Tuck Poon. He is the CEPT coordinator for agenda item 1.2 and is a member of the spectrum engineering team at Ofcom, the UK regulator. They will be presenting the relative positions of RSPG and CEPT, the two policy-making groups that are considering Europe's position on this long-term in connection with WRC 23. We'll then have representatives of the three major interest groups, potential user groups for this spectrum. The first is actually the existing user group. So we'll have Paul Diedman, who's the Director of Spectrum Regulation from Inmarsat. So satellites are existing users of this spectrum and obviously have a keen interest in maintaining access to this spectrum. And we'll hear from Paul as to what it is that the satellite industry is doing with this spectrum and its plans for the future. We'll then have Scott Blue. Scott is the Principal Program Manager for Radio Spectrum Policy at Microsoft, representing, I guess, the unlicensed users of this spectrum and explaining how it is that unlicensed use of this band could be beneficial. And then finally, we have Reza Karimi, who's the Director of Corporate Strategy at Huawei, responsible for this area, and also a visiting professor at LSE. And Reza will be presenting the view from the equipment manufacturers, the IMT equipment manufacturers, who are interested in making this spectrum available for IMT use. So that's the panel this afternoon. As I say, I'll ask each of them to give a relatively short presentation as to their position on this band. If you have any questions at any time, then please do put them into the chat. We will follow up the introductions by a Q&A session, and I very much look forward to hearing questions from the floor during that Q&A. So without further ado, I'll hand over first to Nadia. Nadia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you for the invitation. So I will try to say some words about the situation of this band from European side, from European member states. Next slide, please. We have started working on the EU positions on the agenda items for WRC 23. So we have has been adopted by RSPG, the interim opinion of this ITU for this conference. Next slide, please. And then the next period, let's say for 1 year, we will start working for the final opinion, which will lead to the European, which will make recommendations for a European position, and that will come on the 2023, just some months ahead from the conference. Next slide, please. This interim opinion contains the results of the agenda item identification and their linkage to the European policies, in particular with the EU harmonization decisions that have been gone along. Next slide, please. We have depicted 12 out of 33 agenda items that have a relevant position a relation to the EU policy. I'm not going to say all of them, but you can have a look afterwards on the policy on the when this interim opinion will be published in the RSPG site. The structure of each agenda item is the description of each agenda item and their linkage to the EU policy, and if any harmonized decision is going with. And the recommendation part will come at the next stage of our work. Next slide, please. So here is some things about the upper level of the 6 gigahertz band, as it is depicted also in our interim opinion. So there is the Digital Compass EU communication that has been very lately published by the European Commission. So there is a need for a need to meet the connectivity needs for European citizens and industries until 2020-30, and it seems that 6 gigahertz band could respond to this additional spectrum demand. Since it has a similar technical characteristics as the 3.5 gigahertz. It will also be complementing these two bands, as the spectrum has to be sufficient for a longer term. The European, can you hear me? Because I'm not sure if everything is
okay. There's a slight crackling, but we can hear you okay. So it's fine. Carry on. So no problem. Okay. There is a slight crackling, but we can hear you okay. So carry on. It's fine.
Okay. So lately, the European Commission has also published a decision, a Commission implementing decision on the lower part of this band for the wireless access systems and airlines, where technical conditions are defined. Next slide, please. And now, when it comes to the upper part of this of the 6 gigahertz band, there is fixed links, long distance fixed links, heavily used in Europe for backhauling, as well as fixed satellite links. In addition to that, there is planned the 6.425 up to 7.250 megahertz is planned to be used globally by Copernicus Imaging Microwave Radiometer, which is one of the 6 high priority candidate missions of the Copernicus program. This is affecting the European policies leading to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal policy and the space policy programs. And this also leading us to the obligation for an IMT, for a possible IMT identification needing to protect and share with the existing services. Next slide, please. Sharing is a key challenge for the sufficient use of spectrum. Coexistence studies are also needed. So Europe now is waiting for the outcomes of those studies in order to make its decision. And I think Tak will further talk about where we stand in the AI, in the agenda item 1.2 position in this from CEPT side. Also, we'll also need to find a balance between licensed and unlicensed spectrum use. So my personal view in this issue is that we should consider the situation as an opportunity to find a balanced approach between Wi-Fi and IMT, and not to be as a battleground as far as it concerns the service or IMT identification or licensing schemes. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nadia. That's a very, very helpful introduction to the topic and a useful introduction to the various competing demands for this spectrum. Thank you. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Tak. So as I say, Tak is the CEPT coordinator for agenda item 1.2 and therefore very closely involved with the various studies to gather the evidence necessary to help us in Europe make the correct decision, hopefully, about the future use of the spectrum. So, Tak, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon to everyone in Europe, and morning or afternoon, evening to the rest of the people that's following this conference in different parts of the world. I would like to thank Forum Europe for inviting me to speak in this session. As Graham has said, I'm speaking on behalf of as a SAP coordinator for agenda item 1.2, and I would like to just give a glimpse into the discussions relating to the upper 6 GHz band. So let's move swiftly to the next slide. Yeah, on this slide, you can actually see, I just put up a frequency bands that we are looking at in agenda 1.2. We got 5 frequency bands that's under this agenda item. What Europe is considering is the biggest chunk right at the upper 6 gigahertz. As you can see, that's 700 megahertz there. So just to take a step back, the agenda 1.2 will be discussed in ECCPT1 from the CPT side, and obviously as Working Party 5D from the ITU side. So I just want to highlight one point, which is this second bullet point, which is the REST 245. The IMT identification in region 1 is for the entire 6425 to 7125. But just to note that the global identification is only considered for the top 100 megahertz. And then I like to bring to the attention that the deadline to finalize the technical and operational characteristics from the relevant groups in ITU is next month, 23rd of July. As we've probably seen that the 5D has concluded some of the parameters used for IMT last week, and the marathon run towards the final date, towards the final day of the meeting. And then this week and next week, we've got Study Group 3, Working Party 3, JKLM in their meeting to finalize some of the parameters that they'll be providing. And also working parties in Study Group 4 in early part of July, just before the deadline, although there will be one working party that breaches over before and after the deadline. So I think the resolution states quite clearly that we need to look at the sharing compatibility studies for looking at on the primary service, and also in adjacent service, adjacent band as appropriate. So with that, we can see in the next slide that there will be a wide interest from a lot of stakeholders. So I hope this slide gives a good idea of the services that we are looking at. I'm sure you already know, if you're following this topic, that the two main part would be the fixed service and the fixed satellite service in these bands. And as you've seen it, I've included the footnote in this slide, and depending on the size of your screen, you might not be able to read it, but you probably be able to see it when you download the slides. So those are the few footnotes in there that you would probably identify some of these additional services that's included in it. So this is where I've written down in the other services. You got the ESS passive ranging from 6425 to 7075 and 7075 to 7250. So you can look at those footnotes, and those are the frequency bands where it's has got some allocations too. So I just want to highlight looking at this main slide, the one in bold capital case are the primary services. So those are the few that we looked at. And if we move on to the next slide, that is the European Common Allocation Table, ECA table, which you can download. I've got this information. If you look at the IFIS, which is the ECO Frequency Information System, you can download these services, the affected services within the bands in it. So looking at this, you can actually see that not much, the two main categories are still the fixed and the fixed satellite service. But I think if you look at it, there's one small difference to the radio regulation slide, which I presented earlier on, is the Earth exploration satellite, which Nadia mentioned. There's interest in it. And if you can see that it crosses the entire frequency band that we are considering in the upper 6 gigahertz. So you probably realize that I've put a note there saying that there's a fixed satellite usage interest in the top half from 7075 to 7125 that is not primarily allocated to that band. But in the discussions that we have in 1.2, there are some interest for that. And obviously, there's some great interest from the radio astronomy usage due to the footnote 5.149, which one of the bands is 6650 to 6675.2 megahertz. So there's quite a bit of interest from the radio astronomy. And also, there's interest from the space operation and space research. You'll probably see the allocations in the adjacent band as well. But I think when we look at the footnote, there's a small allocations, primary allocations to one member states for that. So that is the kind of situation that we are looking at in the CPT 1.2 discussions. These are kind of extracted from some of the discussions that we have in 1.2. And if you go to the next slide, which is where we are at. So the situation in CPT, especially in the group that I'm chairing at the moment, the discussions are still in a very early stage. As I've mentioned just now, 5D has just finalized the parameters for the sharing studies, and the deadline for the finalization of the other parameters are not until next month. So the discussions in CPT are still quite early. I would expect a lot of work and studies, initial sharing compatibility studies to be conducted in the next couple of weeks, if not the next couple of months, for discussions in PT1 and 5D towards September and October. So that is the crunch time when we see the first results of the studies, some initial studies results. So we are at a very early stage, and we need to actually wait for the studies to be completed to actually make an assessment on what is needed. So obviously, the protection of the incumbent services is at the utmost importance, and the necessary conditions needs to be in place if IMT is to be considered in that frequency band, as we've done in the past. So I'd just like to say that there's quite a good cooperative spirit within the discussions in 1.2 sessions, although there's quite a robust debates on the use, even though we have not started on the studies yet. But there are some, it's quite good level of discussions in the 1.2 in CPT. And I think this will continue on for the next couple of years when we get the results from the studies and we kind of interpret the results as well. And that will form our basis of deciding what to do next in Europe. And I think that with that, I think I can conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tak. Thank you for that update on the state of play with the agenda item 1.2. Obviously, early days. I think we should be telling Forum Europe that they probably need to repeat this session in a year's time, when hopefully we will be rather further advanced with the sharing studies, and we get a better picture of what is possible and what is not possible in this band going forward. Thank you very much. So we now move on to the three key stakeholder groups who have an interest in this band. The first of which is the satellite industry, and in this case represented by Paul Diedman from Inmarsat, who are existing users of this band and I believe have plans for future use as well. So Paul, please tell us what your plans are.
Yes, thank you very much, Graham, and good day to everybody. Yeah, so my intention with this presentation is to give you an idea of the sort of current and future use of the upper 6 GHz band for satellite communications, but also to give you some sort of preliminary views on the prospects for sharing with some of the terrestrial services, IMT and Wi-Fi. So maybe if you go to the next slide, please, Dan. Yeah, so the top of this slide is similar to the one that Tuck just showed, showing the upper 6 GHz band and where the satellite allocations in the radio regulations sit, and also relative to the bands which are being looked at for IMT. So right from 6425 up to 7125, with part of that just for region 1 and the upper part globally, and then Wi-Fi or RLANs being examined for the whole of that range. So on the satellite part, in the almost the entire range, not quite, it is allocated to FSS in the Earth to space direction. So that's used primarily by geostationary satellite networks, so of course in the uplink direction. So that means that the main concern there from an interference perspective is about interference into the satellite receiver in the geostationary orbit. Although, plus in addition to that, we need to be conscious of the fact that you have transmitting Earth stations which would need to coexist with any new terrestrial service that was introduced in that band. So a smaller part of that band is identified for Appendix 30B, again in the uplink direction. So this is one of a number of bands which are identified in an Appendix 30B, and the purpose of Appendix 30B, which is an article of the radio regulations, the purpose of that is to guarantee to all countries equitable access to the geostationary satellite orbit. And the way it does that is in that particular frequency band, and there's an equivalent of uplink frequencies. It provides allotments to every ITU administration. An allotment consists of a number of frequencies and orbital positions and certain satellite characteristics. So those are preserved for every administration, and so they're important. They have kind of a particular political importance and are particularly important for developing countries. So, and again, the interference issue we need to be conscious of here is primarily one about interference into the satellite receiver, possibly impacting on those planned systems. And then finally, we've got some of the FSS spectrum is identified in the reverse direction, so for downlinks, and limited to feeder links for non-geostationary MSS systems, so systems such as Globalstar and OmniSpace that provide service in other frequency bands like L band and S band, such as voice and data and so on. The feeder links for those networks may operate in this, and some of them do operate in this in the downlink direction here. And here the interference issue is about interference to receiving Earth stations. So next slide, please, Dan. So this is a little bit more about the uplink interference. So your typical characteristics for the satellite are either a global beam, so covering the whole of the visible Earth. That's an example of that on the the right-hand picture, or a regional beam such as the one given on the left, which covers Africa and most of Europe. But in all cases, what the satellite sees is a large number of countries. So the concern is about aggregate interference spread over a wide geographic area, which makes it intrinsically a difficult issue to resolve, and certainly one that needs to be managed at the ITU level. So Inmarsat's use specifically is for feeder links for our MSS network, so feeder uplinks. So this is Inmarsat's service, which provides a service in L-band spectrum, so service to ships, aircraft, and land terminals. But the feeder links between the gateway station and the satellite are provided in this part of the 6 gigahertz band. And that means that if there's interference to the satellite, that can effectively sort of wipe out all of the L-band service that's supported on that particular satellite. So also considering that there are safety services there, the consequences can be quite significant. Other uses, so there's a mixture of national systems, which follow the Appendix 30B plan, and a mixture of commercial systems that provide service throughout a wider geographic area to a number of countries. There are, aside from Inmarsat's use for MSS uplinks, feeder uplinks, there are other MSS systems which also operate the same in this frequency band. And this is also a popular band for telecommand. So that's the signals to control the actual operation of the satellite, which could be a satellite which operates in C-band or any other frequency band. This is a popular band to be used, and that also has sort of quite a high level of importance because it's about the safe operation of the satellite itself. For the future, we don't actually see a significant change in general. This band will continue to be used for these sort of rather specialized satellite applications. And the fact that you've got these planned systems which have this particular political aspect to them is another important factor that means that probably the satellite characteristics which exist today are not going to change significantly in the future. So next slides, please, Dan. Yeah, so quickly looking at some of the studies. So there have been studies done previously in the lower 6 gigahertz band, but we can learn from those. So on the IMT side, there have been studies conducted in the ITU which have determined that quite low power would be necessary, 10 to 15 dBm, and limited to indoor use. And also for studies in RLANs in the lower 6 gigahertz band have also determined that some sort of standard power is not compatible with satellite use and will need to be limited to indoor use or very low power outdoor use. And because the satellite characteristics are pretty much the same in the upper 6 gigahertz and the lower 6 gigahertz band, really we would anticipate the same conclusions would apply to the upper 6 gigahertz band. There's one sort of additional catch in the upper 6 gigahertz band is that you have also receiving earth stations in that band that you don't have in the lower 6. So finally, in the next slide just gives a brief summary then. So for the upper 6 gigahertz bands, the satellite services will remain important, an important component of the overall telecommunications infrastructure for a range of different uses, and that's not going to change significantly. And that includes the planned bands and the MSS feeder links. IMT use, frankly, we can't really see how IMT use could be deployed in this band in a way that would be compatible with satellite use of the frequency band, considering the studies which have been done before. For Wi-Fi use, we think with certain conditions, it does look feasible that Wi-Fi use could be introduced in a way that's compatible with satellite use, looking at what's happened in the lower 6 gigahertz band. And just again, with this sort of slight caveat that it's got these receiving earth stations which exist in the upper 6, which needs to be looked at. So that's it from me. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Graham.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for that very helpful exposition of the existing satellite industry's use of this band and their plans for future use. And I'm sure we'll have a discussion later on about what might or might not be feasible in terms of new uses in this band. And talking of new uses, so the first candidate for new use of this band, and in fact, it's already been implemented in the US, is unlicensed use. And we have Scott Blue from Microsoft, who will tell us all about what is planned in the US and in Europe for possible unlicensed use of this band. Scott, over to you, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham, and good afternoon. I need to start with the Microsoft disclaimer about 5G. Microsoft is very much a 5G company, and when I get pigeonholed in the representative for the unlicensed community, I always have to point out that we've spent billions of euros in investment in the 5G community in the last 18 months. We acquired Affirm Networks and Metaswitch that provide 5G core solutions. We run operational workloads for half the world's operators. And we have some pretty cool products called Azure Edge Zones that provide CBRS and private cellular networks in a private and highly reliable fashion. And I've been involved in this whole IMT 2020 situation since 2013 for Microsoft. Next slide, please. And so in 2014, we had this meeting at 5D in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where this concept of we needed 150 megabits for downlink and 50 megabits for uplink, and to deliver that, we needed 100 megahertz of spectrum per operator. And everybody, including many of the people that are now labeled unlicensed community in this debate, thought that was a great idea, and we're still looking forward to having this ubiquitous 150 megabit of downlink available across Europe. So we moved along to WRC 19, and there were a couple of countries in Region 1 that weren't able to find 100 megahertz of spectrum for all of their operators in the 3 gig and 4 gig ranges, and pushed to study 6 gigahertz as an alternative. It sounds reasonable. It will be a compromise for those countries because they'll miss out on some things. And really in this whole situation, as we've just heard from the satellite community, use of this band for IMT is going to be limited by aggregate interference for satellites. So there's only a certain number of countries that are going to be able to deploy a real IMT network in this band before it starts to cause aggregate interference. And it all seemed like, well, this is where we're going down the road. Well, within 15 minutes of this compromise being reached at WRC 19, members of the mobile community started saying, we've won the top of the band. And since then, we have been told that there isn't the 100 megahertz per operator is not enough to reach the commitment made in 2014, and more capacity is needed. Next slide, please. And the word balancing is used a lot, that we need to balance the 6 gigahertz band for IMT to provide balance. So what we're looking at in that is that 3.4 to 4.2 and 700 megahertz of 6 gigahertz spectrum would be balanced on the IMT side, and 400 and whatever 75 megahertz spectrum would be the balance for the unlicensed side. I think it's worth mentioning, since 2018, there's been this bifurcation of the amount of data as a percentage of total internet traffic used by what's on the end of fixed connections and what's used by the operators. Here's my phone from last night. I don't think that my usage is any different from most people's during the pandemic. And as you can see, less than 1% of the data that I've used on my phone, not my total internet data, has come from the operator. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I could spend a whole half an hour talking about capacity. But I think I'll move to the next slide, please. So this is one of the things that Microsoft is doing to reduce the need for capacity for 5G with our customer Telstra, whereby making the edge the actual camera in their traffic management system. We've reduced the need to transmit stuff over their 5G network by 50 times. So, taking 98% of the traffic off of the air is good for latency. It's good for the environment. It makes the applications faster because basically what you're doing is you're sending the message that there is something that's actionable to an edge node in the operator's network that can immediately be taken to the emergency services or whatever in this case that you're looking for. And next slide, please. So that's one way that we see making things greener. Another green-related issue that has come up in the studies for this band in other jurisdictions is when we were first looking at the upper 6 in the US and in other markets, it became apparent that there is a strange characteristics of physics where this band doesn't travel through double pane glass very well. And there is as much as 10 dB loss over the 3.5 gigahertz band, in addition because of this Windows penetration loss. So what we were arguing for indoor use was that we could actually operate at a higher power indoors because not as much of the signal was getting outside. The pushback to that was, well, if somebody has their window open or they're operating on a balcony, they could still cause interference to fixed links. But if your intention is to try and get coverage indoors in the first place, operating from outside to inside, this is a factor that needs to be looked at. And every time I bring it up, I'm treated like, oh, it's just an argument from the unlicensed guys. But really, the operation is not the same. Quickly to the end. Next slide, please. And then the other issue, and I almost hate to bring this up because it's very much like Ericsson saying they're going to leave Sweden if you don't do what we want, is that this is where the progress is made towards opening the whole, the band across the world. And those green countries are currently going to be able to take advantage of 3 Wi-Fi 7 channels, and there's only going to be 1 channel in Europe. So where is a company like Microsoft going to do their future development? Next slide, please. Right, we currently do the lion's share of the development for our mixed reality products here in Finland. But how are we supposed to create the environment that we want for our customers in people that are in places that are going to be able to use the entire band when the developers here are going to have to use less? The product is going to perform less than it's going to in other key markets. So you have, it becomes a global competition issue where we have countries like Brazil that are keen to have development for mixed reality, digital twins for factories, and other things that will make use of Wi-Fi 7 happening. And Europe is going to end up being behind. And I will leave it there. Next slide is thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Very, very helpful presentation and very interesting to see not just a radio technologist's perspective on the question, but actually a higher level perspective about what this might mean for global competitiveness and so forth. Okay, our final presenter this afternoon, panelist this afternoon, sorry, is Reza Karimi. Reza with Huawei, but also representing the views of a number of other manufacturers. Reza, over to you.
Thank you, Graham. And hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about the 6 gigahertz opportunity for IMT. So next slide, please. So this first slide is on the need for additional midbands for IMT. And here we'd like to refer to a recent report by Colliago. The report concluded that an additional 1 to 2 gigahertz of midbands will be needed in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe to meet IMT 2020 user data rates for citywide capacity coverage. And this would, of course, also be important for addressing smart city use cases and to provide increased capacity along major transport routes in Europe. And we consider that 6 GHz has an important role in meeting this demand for IMT at mid-bands going forward. But our partners have rightly asked us, can you really provide macrocellular mobile coverage at 6 GHz, given that it's at much higher frequencies compared to other mid-bands used by mobile networks? So we've tried to address this question. So next slide, please. So we've addressed this question by doing some field tests of our 5G NR prototypes at 6 GHz in a macrocellular deployment. We did this in an urban environment using the same commercial sites as 3.5 GHz, and you can see a picture of the layout of the trial on the top left. And what we found was that we can get very similar throughputs of at 6 GHz as we can at 3.5 GHz. And you can see a cumulative distribution of the measured spectral efficiencies in the graph on the right-hand side. And the reason why we can get such high throughputs at 6 GHz is because we can use more antenna elements at 6 GHz, and this can compensate for the increased path loss, given that radio propagation at 6 GHz is not materially different than at 3.5 GHz. So we certainly think 6 GHz has great potential for macrocellular mobile coverage via IMT. Next slide, please. Now, some commentators call 6 GHz a battleground between IMT and Wi-Fi, but we see things somewhat differently. We see 6 GHz as an opportunity for balance between licensed use of spectrum, i.e. for IMT, and license-exempt use of spectrum, i.e. for RLAN. IMT and RLAN both have important roles to play. Midbands are key to 5G NR and Wi-Fi. Sufficient spectrum should be ensured for the development of both. But I think it's important to draw a quite clear clarification and distinction here that 5G NR and Wi-Fi are fundamentally different in design. Wi-Fi uses a stochastic MAC optimized for unlicensed spectrum, whereas 5G NR uses a deterministic MAC. And this deterministic MAC is optimized for licensed spectrum. And this deterministic MAC is what gives 5G NR its real strength. Next slide, please. Yes, that one. So this slide shows the performance of 5G NR, and it's about the results of some tests we did recently to assess 5G NR in an indoor deployment in a warehouse. We used 16 5G NR base stations and actually 16 Wi-Fi access points at the same locations. And we used them to serve 96 user terminals, both NR terminals and Wi-Fi terminals. And because NR uses a deterministic MAC, where we were able to use what's known as distributed MIMO, that is, we could jointly process the signals from the antennas of all the 16 base stations to form very tight spatial beams. And this could give us a huge spectral efficiency. And you can see at the top right, we could get 115 bits per second per hertz on the uplink. And you can only really do this kind of multi-base station processing with a deterministic MAC, which is a characteristic of 5G NR. Next slide, please. So we'd like to provide a few further observations here. The first relates to the Wi-Fi offload. What we're seeing in some markets is that the deployment of 5G NR is meaning that the MNOs are doing less offload to their Wi-Fi networks, and the chart on the left shows the case in South Korea, where while the total MNO traffic has been steadily increasing, the proportion offloaded to Wi-Fi has actually been decreasing. And then on the right-hand side, this is about the use of Wi-Fi at home and the fact that there's little point having huge throughputs with Wi-Fi in your home if the backhaul speeds to the internet are limited and that the backhaul is a bottleneck. Again, this is something which policymakers should bear in mind when looking at all these different issues. Next slide, please. Okay, and on this slide, we wanted to highlight another item which deserves some attention. As you can see on the left, while some countries have assigned the whole of 6 GHz for our LAN use, other countries have not made such a decision. And needless to say, it's important that our LAN equipment should respect national and regional regulatory requirements. But importantly, as regulators often remind us, receiver characteristics play a very important role in efficient use of spectrum. And so RLAN receivers should have sufficiently high selectivity at 6.425 megahertz so as not to compromise potential future deployment of IMT in the upper 6 gigahertz. And we think this is something which should be appropriately addressed in the harmonized standards. And my next slide, which will be my last slide, please. So in case you hadn't noticed, we're advocating for a balanced approach towards licensed use of 6 gigahertz and license exempt use of 6 gigahertz. The lower 6 gigahertz, as we know, is already harmonized for RLAN across Europe. As for the upper 6 gigahertz, there's an agenda item for WRC for IMT identification of the band. We consider that by using technologies such as active antenna systems with very tight beamforming, it's possible for us to deploy wide area coverage macro cells and protect the incumbents as well. So we think it's important that administrations wait for the outcome of the ITUR process for WRC23. Regulations should specify limits on the radiations, maximum permitted radiations towards the incumbent receivers. And then regulations should allow industry to come up with interference mitigation mechanisms to comply with those limits. And we think this is a unique opportunity to ensure spectrum harmonization for IMT and to arrive at the right balance between licensed and license-exempt spectrum availability. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Reza. Very helpful summary of the position from the IMT manufacturer's position. Okay, I'll invite everybody back into the room, as it were. We already have quite a few questions from the audience. So just to remind us of the audience, if you do have any questions, then please pop them into the chat and we'll see how many we can answer in the time available. So we've had a couple of questions already about issues around whether it's appropriate for Europe to be taking this relatively slow approach to making a decision about this band. So first of all, a question, is Europe going to wait until WRC23 has reached a conclusion, which Reza just suggested it should do? Or is there the possibility that Europe might actually make a decision more quickly than that? And as a sort of related question, is Europe missing the boat here? As we've already discussed, a number of other countries or regions have already made decisions on this band and are moving forward. Is there a risk that by waiting until the result of WRC23, actually we'll be behind the curve on this one, and Europe should make its decision sooner, much sooner, in order to be up with everybody else, which I guess is where Microsoft would like us to be, Scott, so that you can be doing your developments in a region that has presumably the full bandwidth available for unlicensed use, if that was the decision Europe came to. So Nadia, as the representative of the European policy decision-making process here, what's your view about whether Europe's going to make a decision earlier than WRC23, and if it is, whether that, if that's the right thing to do, or whether it should wait until WRC23 before making its decision?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Europe still needs to balance all the needs, including the existing users in this band. But I think it will definitely have a position before WRC. So, but of course, we need to to see about the outcomes of the studies. It is an ongoing process with lots of discussions and interactions, and this will go on in the group too. So, and I am optimistic that we will have a decision before WRC.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to come in on this question before I throw it at one of you?
Sure, I'll grab it.
Go.
Yeah, I think it's important to also note that there is the first draft of the 802.11be standard, which will constitute what becomes Wi-Fi 7. And so that development ecosystem is starting now. So at least there needs to be some hope out there. One of the things that could happen is we could do the coexistence studies for the top of the band in Europe so that we're in a position to make that decision quickly once the WRC decision is made. So there's more information that, to at least make it look like it's not going to take forever in Europe. It's just one suggestion. Thanks.
Reza.
Thank you, Graham. I think on the question of missing the boat, we hear often that, for example, a certain frequency band is really important and critical for radio astronomy because of the specific characteristics of the frequencies. Here's the news. If you want mobility, high capacity, wide area coverage, mid-bands is the only spectrum you can achieve it in. So really, missing the boat means using mid-bands for local area, small connectivity, which from a spectrum engineering perspective doesn't make sense. So I think missing the boat should be looked at in terms of our long-term availability of mid-bands. And should we wait or not? Well, I think if we don't know what's possible to be done, as I said, regulations should set the limits for protecting the incumbents, and industry will be able to provide measures to meet those limits. And then administrations can make profit decisions based on what industry is able to achieve, for example, in terms of macrocellular deployment.
Thank you, Reza. Paul, just from the satellite industry's point of view, would you like Europe to make a decision quickly, or are you happy for this to drag on until the end of 2023?
Yeah, to be frank, Graham, I'm quite puzzled by the way Europe seems to be handling this issue, insofar that we've got this agenda item for the WRC, which is looking at whether we can identify the bands, 6 gigahertz bands for IMT. But I'm not really seeing any discussion about what would be done with Wi-Fi, what the conditions would be. Is there a need for Wi-Fi? How would that work? That discussion seems to be absent so far. And I think it would be in a very bad position if we got to WRC 23 and we didn't know whether we wanted the band for Wi-Fi or for IMT or for something else or a mixture of both. It would be terrible if we, discussing IMT in the ITU at the World Conference, without knowing really what we wanted at the WRC. So yeah, I'm really hoping that something is going to happen shortly in Europe to really get the discussion kind of on an even keel, because at the moment it seems a very unbalanced discussion from what I see. Thanks.
Sorry, just to be clear, so you see the discussion as focused on IMT rather than the alternative of an unlicensed use or the status quo, effectively?
Yes, exactly. So as far as I can see, there's no analysis being done in CPT or in the EU about whether the band should be identified for or harmonized for Wi-Fi. That discussion doesn't seem to be taking place, and I think it should be taking place right now and probably should be done in parallel with the IMT discussion.
Thank you. Nadia, do you want to come on that? I mean, it's more an RSPG question than a CEPT question, because I see it as a policy question rather than a technical question. Is the RSPG looking at whether the upper 6 gigahertz should be used for unlicensed and what the benefits of that would be vis-a-vis IMT?
No, we haven't started talking or discussing these issues, but it is indeed there is a variety of approaches. I mean, variety. There is the unlicensed and the licensed models. Also, there is some countries have proposed to allocate the band as license exempt. Others like unlicensed. There is also the LSA, the shared model too. So it is important to consider the needs and the restrictions for each model. but for the moment, I think that each member state is discussing in its own those issues.
So maybe we should recommend to the RSPG that
it
does take a coherent look at what is the best use of the upper 6 gigahertz band in Europe, and not to be driven purely by the WRC agenda. Well, that's a useful takeout from this discussion. I've got a slightly different question, mainly for the technical guys, and in particular Tuck and Reza. So if I understood you correctly, Reza, you were suggesting that the Europe should come up with a set of requirements to protect existing users in the band, and it will then be for the mobile industry, the IMT industry, to come up with technology that can meet those requirements. Is that a correct summary of what you were suggesting?
Yeah, so well, actually, I was referring to the ITUR regulations, not necessarily CPT. But we hear from RSPG and European regulators that we should promote sharing, and we should protect the incumbents, and we should have least restrictive technical conditions. So, and studies which are not based on worst case upon worst case assumptions, and that's all very good. Let's apply that. If the victim is a satellite in a geostationary orbit, set a power limit for radiation towards that orbit, and allow industry to develop technologies like active antenna systems to comply with that. We're confident that with reasonably balanced studies of coexistence, the limits that would apply, we can meet by using advanced technologies, and we can deploy macrocellular at 6 gigahertz and protect the incumbents. That's an example of flexible regulation.
Well, thank you, Reza. So sort of throw the baton over to Tuck. So Tuck, is that what is happening in the sharing studies? Or, I mean, traditional sharing studies, you specify what the characteristics are of each of the services, and you just work out whether they're compatible or not. But I gather from what Reza is suggesting that he's suggesting a completely different approach, which is to say, what are the protection requirements of satellite? And then, yes, you can have IMT in this band as long as you meet those requirements. Is that an approach that might be acceptable to CEPT and WRC, or is that just so different from the way that we normally do things that it's not going to work?
Yes, I think what Reza has mentioned is quite an interesting concept of what do you need to actually protect the satellite service or the incumbent services, and this is a set of requirements that you need to do that. But I think the approach that we are taking in 1.2 or the WRC preparation process is we kind of try to define the systems that we'll put into those bands. And with those systems, we need to define a set of characteristics or representative characteristics of those new systems and try to see how would it affect the incumbent services. So I think Reza pointed out something very interesting there, that the active antenna systems, AAS, as we call it in ITU, this is a kind of new technology compared to IMT Advanced. I think there's some preempt of some results of sharing studies at the moment that's saying that we have done the sharing studies for the lower part of the 6 gigahertz. Maybe we can reuse some of these results for the upper part. Unfortunately, I think the system characteristics are quite different. So therefore, it is not easy for you to actually try to gather those results and apply it somewhere else. I think the concept of what we're doing in 1.2 especially is we know what the systems that we want to put into the band, which is the IMT 2020. So that has got a specific set of parameters, which is quite different. So with that, you can kind of define what the protection is needed for the satellite. So if the system is different, then the characteristic will be different, and you would have a different set of protection that you need. So I think what Reza has proposed is quite an interesting way to look at it. But I think potentially one way to look at that side is to first do the studies first with those systems that we have defined, and do the sharing studies and see if there are elements of those new systems are applicable to other systems like Wi-Fi or anything that uses the same technology, then we can kind of see that it is comparable, and potentially that is a kind of a set of requirements that is needed to protect the satellite service, and then you apply that accordingly. So I think we probably need to do it step by step. And I think what Reza has proposed is quite an interesting way that we could look at it in the future. But let's do the first step. Let's take the first step now, and then we will continue those discussions. And I think we got a couple of more years to discuss through what we need to do. But I think it is quite clear in our mind, in 1.2 especially, that we need to define those new systems. We need to see how those new systems will coexist with the incumbent services. And then from there, we will see where it leads us to. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuck. So I guess, sorry, Nadia.
No, may I add something that I completely agree with Tuck, and it's a nice proposal from Reza. I just wanted to add that although spectrum licensing is not an issue to be considered by WRC or the preparations for WRC, but of course there is a link between the identification of spectrum for IMT or for other services and licensing spectrum to mobile network operators.
Indeed. Okay. Yes, thank you. And I think I urge everybody on both sides or all sides of the table to work together to try and come up with the best possible technical solution or technical parameters, shall we say, to ensure that we in Europe make the best possible use of this spectrum. Okay, going on a slightly different tack, we've had a number of questions challenging, I guess, the belief that this spectrum is actually needed by IMT, and there's sort of two strands to that. The first is there's the C-band, and there is more C-band spectrum than is currently made available for mobile use in most of Europe. So we across most of Europe, we're looking at 3400 to 3800, but there is also the 3800 to 4200 spectrum, albeit obviously there are other users in that band as well. But so one part of the question is, wouldn't that be a better choice than the 6 gigahertz? And a sort of parallel question relates to millimeter wave. Where did microwave come from? Millimeter wave spectrum. So we're making all this spectrum available at 26 and 28 gigahertz, depending upon where you are in the world. Wasn't that supposed to be the solution to 5G capacity requirements? Why is it now that having put all this effort into developing 26 and 28 gigahertz technology and making that spectrum available across huge amounts of spectrum available in those bands, what's gone wrong? Why is that not what the mobile industry needs for 5G or 6G for that matter? So who's going to come back on that one first? Reza, are you happy to answer that one?
I can take that, thanks. Yeah, so, and in previous slides last year, I remember, we said, millimeter waves and mid-bands are complementary. They're not substitutes. Actually, what we're proposing 6 gigahertz is for citywide coverage, and you cannot have broad citywide coverage with millimeter waves cost effectively. Now, actually, millimeter waves are great for a lot of industrial use cases, for example, which is something actually people are now starting to look at. The point is, as I said earlier, mid-band spectrum is really the only band where you can have high capacity wide area coverage. And you mentioned, Graham, 3438. Okay, that's harmonized for 5G today. Where is the roadmap for going forward? Okay, some people believe mobile use will not increase anymore. We're static. Well, for those people, yes, we don't need any more spectrum. But we're of the firm belief that mobile spectrum is needed to meet with the increasing demands. I mean, we need a roadmap. Now, 3.8 to 4.2, people are not talking about nationwide licensing. The people are talking about local licensing for verticals. So that leaves us 6 gigahertz, which we're talking about. If we show studies which say 1 to 2 gigahertz. Even if you don't believe that, even if half of that is correct, you need both a combination of 3842 and 6 gigahertz to meet the requirements.
Thank you very much indeed, Reza. We've pretty much run out of time, so it just leaves it to me to thank all of our panelists for an excellent session. Thank you all very much indeed for your introductory remarks and your answers to the questions. I look forward to the rest of the conference. Back to you, Dan.
Graham, thank you very much. And yeah, echoing again that thanks, and thanks to you, Graham, for moderating so well as well. So yeah, yet another panel. I say this after every single one, I think, but yet another one that could have carried on for at least double the time, I think. And I almost actually felt there was 2 panels going on, because the amount of chat and discussion that that you guys have raised in the chat. Also, there was a separate discussion going on there. So definitely stimulated that well. So guys, thank you all so much for that, and really do appreciate that. So yeah, sorry again to have to draw that one to a close, but yeah, we do now need to move on, because coming up straight away now, we're moving straight on to our showcase sessions today. So I think some of the issues that we have been looking at now will actually, I'm sure, be covered again in the showcase sessions, particularly one of the ones on stage 4 here. But you can see here the 4 showcase sessions that we now have running. They're going to be starting almost immediately in about 3 or 4 minutes over on our showcase stages. So on showcase stage 1, we have a session which is looking at developing sustainable competitive advantage in 5G via spectrum strategy. So focusing across the mid, low and millimeter wave bands, and that's hosted by LeMay Yates. Showcase stage 2, we have a session focusing on market insight by Ericsson. Showcase stage 3, Ultra Wideband Alliance having a session looking at enabling new efficient possibilities for multi-radio consumer devices. And on showcase stage 4, continuing the discussion on 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7, and looking at innovative applications, protecting incumbents and creating new opportunities for better connectivity. And that one's hosted by Facebook alongside DSA. So those are all starting now. Again, a quick reminder, because obviously those are running in parallel. So all of the showcases will be recorded, so you'll be able to catch up on any ones that you're not able to follow live afterwards. But please do make your way over to those showcase sessions now. They're going to be starting in about 3 minutes now. Yeah, we look forward to seeing you over there in one of those. And then after that, we do have a short break before we're back here on the main stage for our final session of the day at 4:15 Central European time, 4:15 Brussels time, where we're going to be moving the focus on to the millimeter wave and looking at millimeter wave frequencies. For now, thank you to Graham. Thank you to all of our panelists. Please do make your way over to the showcase sessions, and we'll see you again back here on the main stage shortly. Thank you.